film. It's the reviews look great. As of yesterday, it was 87% at Rotten Tomatoes. That's not too shabby, right? So,
okay.
Can you speak a little bit about adapting the film from the source material? I haven't read the Southern Reach trilogy, but from what I've seen in the press, it's a very loose adaptation. What drew you to that material?
It is a loose adaptation, I think that's fair to say. I had worked on 2 adaptations prior to this. One was a literary novel by a novelist Kazuo Ishiguro called Never Let Me Go. And that was probably, when people think of adaptation, that is the purest form of adaptation, where
it's pretty good source material.
It's fantastically good source material, and the intention was to be faithful. And so literally some of the dialogue was cut and pasted from the novel. And then I've done a comic book adaptation called Dread, which is based on a British comic book character. And I think by the time I'd done those 2, what I understood was that when you do an adaptation, you have to make a decision about what is the thing you are adapting. And if the first one was a kind of neurotic, slavish adaptation, the second one was slightly more zeroed in actually on a character. And in this instance, I thought that the most defining thing about the novel was its atmosphere. And in some respects, that meant that specifics of plot were not crucial, maybe, but tone was very important. And I did a slightly odd thing, which was I didn't reread the book. The book is a slightly dreamlike novel, slightly hallucinatory novel. And so what I did was I did an adaptation of my memory of the novel from a read. It's sort of a slightly odd conceit, but that's what I did.
And I think that dreamlike quality, certainly comes through in the film. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the film's genre, right? Because people seem to have trouble deciding what it is in the press. So The Guardian called it sci-fi fantasy, but Metacritic called it action, adventure, sci-fi, drama, mystery, thriller, fantasy, horror.
Okay. So, I think what I'd start by saying is that genre itself is a slightly complicated term, and you could call something science fiction, which could range from Star Wars to 2001, and they're terribly different kinds of films. So, there's something problematic is immediately embedded in that. Genre is shorthand, essentially, and it has useful functions. I mean, I've worked in genre a lot, and one of the things is that things that you might take a long time to explain in genre you can do quite quickly because people understand the tropes of that particular genre. So that can be useful in what is oddly in film quite a sort of short form medium, where you kind of need to be moving at a bit of a clip sometimes. And what kind of genre is it? I don't give a shit, really. I mean, it's sort of science fiction, it's sort of horror, I don't really care. It's itself as much as possible.
You persist to work in genre in certain sorts of ways, right? Is it because of that capacity to push against the expected or the boundary?
Well,
because you definitely don't stay in a genre, but the films are seen to be genre films, and in a kind of self-reflexive register.
I've got no issue with genre, I should say. One of the good things about genre is, like I said, that shorthand. You could in a way you could say those are like free gifts, in terms of how quickly you can set something up, or the way in which you can unfold something, and also sort of establishing terrain maybe and something like that. But there's another free gift, which is that when people then have expectations of beats, you can subvert the beats. So that one of the free gifts is subversion. And I think very broadly, I'm 47. I grew up kind of in the transition from hippies to punks, and there's something about subversion that I like, and I'm just attracted to. And so one of the things that genre gives me is the ability to fuck with it.
And it also seems to give you the ability to be a kind of stealth operator, right? So you're bringing two genres that are, enormously popular in Hollywood cinema right now. A real intellectual, introspective edge, right, that takes the genre in a really different direction.
I think when I look back over my film making life, which is approximately 20 years thereabouts, one of the things I've consciously tried to do in the last few years is to stop smuggling stuff into films and do it overtly. I think that in the first film I worked on properly was 28 Days Later, which is a zombie movie. And there were all sorts of things in there that were smuggled in. And I'm not actually sure that's helpful. There was a sort of break point for me, which was a film called Sunshine, which had a sort of thanks. but it did have a kind of very difficult internal battle with itself about where genre was pulling it and in fact what it was about themically. And I thought that some of that was a mistake, and I consciously tried to step away, I guess, from that.
It's interesting that you see the film as particularly overt, right? Because it's exquisite at capturing a sense of slow-burning suspense or dread, that borrows from suspense or horror as you watch the film. And there were definitely, admittedly, I'm an easy scare, but there are definitely moments I kind of jumped out of my seat in watching it.
Good.
But it's pretty opaque at a lot of levels, right? It's a film that's asking a lot from its audience.
Yeah, but the opacity could be the thing that you're being overt about.
And do you think that love of ambiguity and opacity has roots in your origin as a writer?
I think it often has something to do with the thing I was previously working on. So, I could keep saying this through my entire working life, which goes prior to film into novels. Something about the thing I'm doing is always a reaction against the thing I just did. So the film I name-checked briefly, Dread, which was the comic book movie, is a kind of slightly psychotic, nihilistic movie, which was an opposition to Never Let Me Go, which was a clockwork movie. And Ex Machina is a kind of a clockwork movie in many respects, and Annihilation is much more kind of intuitive and trippier. So it's got something to do with that.
Yeah, because Ex Machina is super taut, right? And I wouldn't describe Annihilation as taut, right? It's a little rambly, but not in a bad way. Right? Do you think that? It seems generous to make a film these days, especially a relatively large budget one, that asks its audience to meet it halfway in its ambiguity or opacity. I don't think most people give the audience that much credit in tentpole filmmaking these days.
It's a very sort of complicated question, that. For me.
That's because I'm a professor. We always ask complicated questions.
Well, it's a good question. All films, all narratives that are presented to audiences are actually doing a 50-50 deal, whatever, because half of the narrative, in a way, is provided by the audience member and their subjective agenda and what they feel about the world and everything, really. So kind of that's always happening. I do, separate to that, think it is important, and this sounds kind of ingratiating to the people in the room, and I don't mean it that way. It is important to give audiences credit. It really, really is. And there is something frustrating about the number of films that are so explicit in themselves. One of the things it means is that at the point of the film ending and leaving the cinema, there really is nothing left to think about or to explore. There's really nothing to discuss. And I find that makes the films truly forgettable, in a literal way, that they're forgettable. Because what are you remembering? What are you continuing to turn over? And anyway, clearly it's not good to treat audiences with contempt in a sort of continuous, reflexive way. How could that be a good thing, essentially?
Is your studio as enthusiastic about complexity in film?
What I find is they're often enthusiastic at the point they decide to make the film because they feel virtuous. You know, they feel like, yes, you know, we are encouraging sort of non-franchise cinema. Here we go, and then you deliver it, and they have a panic attack. It's the last 3 films I've made, Dread, Ex Machina, and Annihilation, have all effectively been rejected by the studio on their delivery, and or sections within the studio. I think it would be fairer to say, and that's been a nightmare. But it's done now.
Yeah, I think audiences appreciate it nonetheless, right? So when my
because
husband...
of the audiences that flock to the films, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, what happens is, and this is the reason the studio get anxious, is that you then have a very limited audience.
Yeah, although I left the film with much the kind of experience you described, hoping to evoke, right? Where the film stayed in conversation in the car on the ride home, and because I live in Los Angeles, that can be a long way, right? Lots of time in the car, and stayed with me after seeing it to think back to moments and reflect. And I do actually find often films, maybe because I'm going to them with a 15-year-old, a week later I don't remember a character, you know, in any kind of depth. And I mean, I think you very much succeeded in creating a film that asks us to live with it for a little bit and think about what it might mean and what it means to us.
Cool. I mean, yes, I mean, that was partly the intention. But it also has its own embedded kind of thesis, that's really what it's driving for. But I guess it's an approach to a thesis rather than being the thing itself.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about what those themes might be, right? What the thesis of the film is. It seems to have both a lot to say about individuals and their relationship to themselves, and then larger sets of themes that might get us reflecting on the world we live in today and some of its dangers and possibilities. But if you were going to tell us what, you know, so I'll get to have my view, since you said audiences get half of it, right? But if you're going to tell us what the film's about, what's it about?
Why don't you start?
Why don't I start?
Yeah.
I'd rather you start, because I'm gonna arc us into some other conversations.
Okay.
But I promise I'll tell you.
That's cool. I mean, in what I said, that 50-50 deal, it is a 50-50 deal.
Yeah.
It took me a long time to really understand that, even though the evidence for it started immediately in my working life. The first thing I wrote was a novel called The Beach, and The Beach was, within it, a kind of criticism of a backpacker scene. It wasn't saying it's all bad, but it contained within it a criticism. And some people saw it as a celebration. And I initially saw that as a failure on my part, but then I understood this is actually the contract, this is the deal that you have between presenter of narrative and recipient of narrative, that in fact the recipient is one of the creators of the narrative, effectively. So it took me a long time to really, truly understand that. It's one of those things I can understand in an intellectual way, but not in a kind of internal way. But by the time I made Annihilation, I did understand that. So I have my sense of what it's about, and some of it is conscious and intentional, and some of it you realise retrospectively, and then you have yours, and it's not delegitimized by being different from mine, and I mean that sincerely. So from my point of view, in a conscious way, it was very simply about the nature of self-destruction. And so actually, here's an example of where the interpretability can get mixed up. So I have 5 people enter into an existential space that is getting bigger and getting closer. and all of them have self-destructive tendencies. Now that can be read by an audience member as only self-destructive people enter, or it could be we're all self-destructive, and that rather depends on the audience member, I suppose. From my point of view, it was that we are all self-destructive. There's a line in the middle of the film where somebody points out that almost nobody commits suicide, but almost everybody self-destructs. And it came from a realization that everybody I knew, once I got to know them well enough, had odd self-destructive impulses. And that interested me, and I thought, why is that? And I thought, I had a kind of, the way I don't like spelling it out as clearly as this, because there's so much bullshit sort of embedded within it. But it's something along the lines of a rather sort of untrustworthy generalization about anorexia would be that classy. I better fucking hope my phone's on silent now.
I left mine in the back.
That was classy. So the anorexia is the exerting of control over a body that is uncontrollable because of the stage it's at in life, perhaps. Okay, so it occurred to me that the act of self-destruction came from a kind of a constant unconscious awareness of our own mortality, of an unknowable existential thing that's getting closer to us, that whatever we do will destroy us, and what we're doing is owning unconsciously a piece of that self-destruction. So that was the sort of underlying principle of the movie, but I think it also it has other things that came out more unconsciously, which are well, not exactly unconsciously, which are to do with maybe my own forms of self-destruction and sort of depression or psychiatric type issues, and I think those things are embedded in the film as well. So, right, your turn.
I agree with those things. I think one of the ways they manifest in the film and the way that I experienced it as an audience member is also in the kind of multiple selves we inherit. And I thought the end of the film very nicely kind of suggested the selves that are multiple in each of us as the dance or fight sequence unfolds at the end with Lena, but also the sense that Kane may be himself or he may not. He may be someone entirely else, but the kind of avatars we produce for ourselves seen within the film.
Cool.
So, I have to have you come to my classes now, because I try to suggest to my students that the audience really does make meaning from the text that they engage, right?
I mean,
and they're so skeptical. So now I could go back and say, but Alex Garland said.
I
got many coolness points.
But the demonstration of the point is two good friends who know each other well and respect each other's opinion, who read the same book and disagree about it. Yeah. I mean, you don't need much more evidence than that. Yeah. I don't think. What does interest me about it a lot is that it is actually so self-evident that subjectivity is a very important part of the experience of a book or a film or a piece of music or whatever, and yet there's an odd amnesia about that with ourselves the whole time. So what we think broadly is that our subjective opinion is right, it's objective. This film is shit, this book is good. There's no sort of room for discussion about it. There's no inherent understanding, automatic understanding, that really what you're saying is my opinion is this. And that amnesia thing really surprises me. That we just exist in a completely subjective state that we're convinced is objective, basically.
And that subjective state is so mutable in and of itself, right?
Well, by being subjective, yeah.
And backstage, as we talked about, coming to a film or a book you loved in the past and realizing your current self, hates it.
Well, that's another very, very good example, because if one can oneself revisit something and have a completely different experience, then that also underlines the subjective response. I've so often, in fact, actually today, I read an article about the actress Molly Ringwald revisiting some of the films that she'd made with John Hughes in the 1980s, and I'm very fond of those movies in my memory, and in a way I understood exactly what she was saying, but I felt protective of my own memory of it and didn't want to disrupt it, thinking there would be something inappropriate that I hadn't even remembered anyway, and sort of want to hold on, particularly because I really enjoyed those John Hughes films, and they sort of made me feel warm and comfortable when I was a teenager. I don't want to lose it.
I was resisting that when I read it as well, right? Because the films were of a kind of moment of a zeitgeist, right? And I want to hold on to the moment, even if I recognize the flaws, right? It also seems the film, even though the conceit for the shimmer, for the existential dread, is alien, it also seems the film has something to say about what happens when DNA goes awry or cells take on new forms or mutations occur, that there might be a hint of a larger socio-political critique at work in the film.
Well, it's something to do with the relationship between construction and destruction, and that construction often involves a bit of destruction in order to get going. And that might relate to that kind of instinctive attachment to that slightly punk subversion or breaking of things, possibly. But I just think it's true. And anyway, as an atheist, and my belief system on how we happen to be here, revolving around evolution, which is a product of mutation,
right.
Then it all kind of makes sense that there's a changing and a breaking in order for the making.
Well, the film talks about sort of distortion of form, both at the kind of cellular level with Lena, right, but in the nether spaces as well, right, and it's playing with distortions of form. So from its generic categories all the way through in really lovely ways.
Yeah, in some ways that probably ties into the sort of depression aspect where the same things look different depending on your state of mind. It's the prism that it puts in front of the world, which is a distorting prism.
And I think apart from the narrative, the film is so hypnotically beautiful and simultaneously grotesque, right? Seeing it on the giant screen at the ArcLight in Hollywood was quite immersive and spectacular. But the visuals also, flowers go demonic, animals fall apart, right? Mutations occur, right? At the visual level, the film seems a kind of insistent critique of sort of the possibility of mutation or where we might go. Like I was reading yesterday an article about, in the last year, we've identified 50 sites in the brain and in genetic structure that we could tie to IQ, and the kind of possibility now of very finely tailored humans based on knowing where in the genome IQ, a year ago we knew none, now we know 50 points in the genome.
Right. I'd be a bit suspicious of that.
Yeah, I would be very as we return to our eugenicist past, I would be, incredibly suspicious of it. But is there any of that in the film, or is that just my 50%?
There's no eugenics, but there's, but yeah, no, in terms of the beauty, I think that's quite important. I mean, beauty's got all sorts of odd aspects to it, but the most basic is that it's seductive and that it pulls you in. And also it's unexpected, and the film is essentially, it reaches a point, a sort of psychedelic point, really, at a certain. Yeah, I mean that's reasonably early on. It gets more psychedelic than that, and something about the beauty was about the nature of psychedelia and the way it pulls you in as well as frightening you. It's seductive as well as scary. It's seductive as well as being disturbing, actually, would probably be a better way of putting it. So that was the intention. There's something sort of lyrical and pulling. Like
the bold blooms were very much like that. Like they were sort of almost gorgeous in the register of abstract art, but you suspect you wouldn't want to touch them, right? Mold blooming in the wall. Can you talk a little bit about how you come to that kind of intensely visual film when your origin is as a writer?
Well, my origin is as a comic book artist.
Well, that tells us a lot.
My dad was a cartoonist. I grew up around comic books, and I grew up drawing. And for a long time thought that was going to be my job. But it shifted into this other area. But the real answer to that question is to do with the group of people I'm working with and the sort of shared sensibilities and a shared intention, and then everybody bringing their version of that intention, and that picture contains it, because what you have is a framed shot, which as arranged by the DOP, and then you also have some visual effects, and so it's a group of people working in concert, asking themselves what is beautiful, what is strange, how do we achieve it, how do we avoid repeating things that have been done before, what is a fresh way of looking at this, and so on.
So is your process highly iterative, or are you like storyboarded from the get-go with a total idea of what you want?
No, the process is to write a script and then disseminate it amongst a group of people, usually substantially people I've worked with an awful lot in the past, some of whom for 20 years. The production design team and the producers, I've never worked on a film that wasn't with them, and I think that's either 7 or 8 films, I can't remember now. So it's write a script, spread it out, see what everyone thinks, and not be open to what everyone's saying.
And how much do you do a lot in post?
Tons, yeah. Post is a big deal.